Good evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Tsukerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us is Jan Jekielek. He's the senior editor at the Epoch Times. He hosts a show, and he's just written a book that addresses the issue of organ harvesting in China, and we'll talk about it momentarily. Thank you so much for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, about the book, how you came up with the specific title, and why now? What made you choose that particular topic?
Well, a lot of fantastic questions. And Irina, it's so great to be on with you here. Well, so this is a really, for some strange reason, a very undercovered issue for an extreme human rights violation that happens at scale in communist China. I mean, if it happened anywhere, I kind of have the same level of gravity. But so we're talking about something that is quite extreme. There's organ trafficking happening in different parts of the world. There's black market organ trafficking scenarios in many countries, actually. And that's horrible in itself. What's happening in communist China is sort of a different level. It's a large scale. It's from prisoners of conscience who are incarcerated. It's for a lot of money. There's a huge kind of monetization aspect to it. And let me just briefly explain how it works for the benefit of the audience, because it's kind of unique. You need a state actor. In this case, it's the Chinese Communist Party to make this happen. There's a couple of things you need, which is the ability to control all the information in the society and basically be able to push mass propaganda through a population to dehumanize a group of people. That's an essential element. Another essential element is the ability to incarcerate a large group of people. And I'll explain why these are important to get this killed to order, which is the title of my book, this kill to order type organ trafficking. So in communist China, it has a history of creating what you call black classes, okay? In the very early years, it was the landowners because they wanted, the communists wanted to seize the land from the landowners, but they needed to basically convince the population that this was okay. You generally don't like to steal from your neighbor or hurt them in the process and so forth. So this mass propaganda was a very important element, and you'd pick a group, you'd vilify them, dehumanize them in the eyes of the rest of the population, and actually the talking points would be similar to what the Germans used against the Jewish people in the 30s. So that they're dangerous, that they're below us, that they're kind of not quite at our level, that they're suspicious and pariahs and other, right? And what that does is it activates a quirk in our psychology. Unfortunately, this has happened too often in history where we kind of accept real bad things being done to this group that's now been dehumanized and vilified. So the Chinese Communist Party has used this for decades, basically, and there's always at least one black class. And by the way, they also blame all the problems of the society on the black class because it can never be the fault of the Communist Party, the bad things that are happening. Okay, so that I'm just setting this up so you understand that there's this ability and kind of standard practice of creating these black classes. And so the other part that's important to understand is what does it look like in an ethical transplantation system, okay? So an ethical transplantation system, there's an organ registry, people sign up for it, and then one of those people has a catastrophic accident, okay? That's what's needed. Someone has a motorcycle accident or a car accident. That's typically how it happens. And then if I'm a recipient, right, if I'm someone that's looking to get an organ, I need to, there's a few other criteria because our bodies don't accept foreign objects. Our bodies reject foreign objects. So the way that we accommodate that in the transplantation sphere is we say, well, let's look at the blood type of the person. And then if we match the blood type, they'll be less likely to, our body will be less likely to reject the organ. And also the tissue type, the histology. And finally, the size has to be similar. And so there's all these variables that have to match. And that's why we have to wait maybe months or years in some cases to get the right donor for a transplant, because the confluence of all those events, including the catastrophic accident, is very rare. And on top of that, an ethics team has to decide that this person is actually okay to transplant from, because you don't want to transplant from someone who's not entirely dead, right? We need to have some circulation in the body, otherwise those organs get rejected, even from a donor. So an ethics team looks and says this person is definitely never coming back, and so we can transplant for them. So anyway, very rare. Okay. Now, one of the things that alerted us to this kill to order system in China was a whistleblower. He was a transplant surgeon, a heart transplant surgeon, and he had a patient who basically told him, I'm tired of waiting. He had a very bad heart condition, could die anytime. I've got it arranged in China in 2 weeks, scheduled. And the transplant surgeon, he couldn't believe this because there's a couple of red flags here, okay? One of the red flags is that it's scheduled. So that means that catastrophic accident is actually being arranged, right? You can't schedule that. You can't schedule a heart donor, right? Obviously. And the second part is this 2-week time period. How are they getting this 2-week time period? Well, so now we have to go back to 1999. Okay. In 1999, the Chinese Communist Party created its newest black class. Okay. It was called Falun Gong, and they were practitioners of this meditation discipline. It was based in truthfulness, compassion, forbearance, these kind of concepts, and very unusual for a communist system because it was very grassroots, very bottom up. So it had these teachings, but it doesn't, for example, have a roster or membership. There's no hierarchy in it. There's no worship of deity or something like this. But there's a very deep spirituality, right, and connection to the divine and things like this. So it didn't fit into communism very well, and kind of spread like wildfire throughout the population. There were 70 to 100 million people over the course of the 1990s that started to do this. It was bigger than the Communist Party of China. And the dictator at the time, he decided to crush it. Okay, he called, in his words, to eradicate it. Okay, and they said if they made it illegal, then they pushed this mass propaganda through the population to dehumanize these people, kind of black class creation system, if you will. It's not necessarily that you're killing everybody. Okay, there's a whole kind of struggle process where you basically get the person to confess to their wrongs and sort of put genuflect at the altar of the Communist Party and say, yes, whatever I did before was bad. With the landowners, they would say, yes, we shouldn't have been landowners. That was evil. And I will gratefully give all my land to the Communist Party and all this kind of stuff, right? It's a kind of brainwashing. People would have to do it, perform it actually truly or performatively. And if they didn't, that's when it got really bad. And it turned out that the Falun Gong were very difficult to re-educate or transform. The system creates this unusual level of agency, like it's kind of a very self-directed thing. So the people that were doing it were very serious about it. And this is what created the second part to get killed to order. Because in the first part, we have this vast dehumanized population, okay? In the second part, these people are not re-educating. They're not saying, yes, I'm just going to immediately bow to whatever the Communist Party demands of me. They're saying, hey, you're wrong. We're not bad people, actually. They incarcerate perhaps 1 million, maybe 2, a huge number of people. In 2005, the US State Department actually estimated that half of all the people in China's massive incarceration system were Falun Gong practitioners, okay? And now here's how you get the 2 weeks, okay? Because they started blood typing, tissue typing, and organ scanning these people ahead of time in the prisons, okay? So now when someone would come, and this whole industry of transplant tourism was basically to China was created, if I come in and I pay my 100,000 or 200,000 to get, let's say, the new heart, the reason I can get it scheduled in 2 weeks is because my so-called donor is actually an innocent prisoner of conscience incarcerated, and they're pre-matched to me because there's so many people in the system and there's so many people in a database, all these vitals in a database, that perfect match already exists, and they can be grabbed, shipped, and killed to order. And that's the reason my book is called Killed to Order, because it highlights the uniqueness and the kind of extreme nature of this particular type of organ trafficking.
My understanding about all of this was that initially China started this business of selling organs to Western and other international buyers by essentially selling the organs from executed prisoners who were just scheduled to be executed anyway. How did that transition into a system where they're literally grabbing people just for the purpose of organ harvesting?
So there was this kind of thing where prisoners were being killed for organs prior to 1999. In fact, I recall there was a congressional hearing in 1998 that highlighted this. But this was all at a very low scale. Okay. I don't think there were any tourists at the time. I think this was very specific, maybe for a high level leader. They found that so there's an example of a soldier that was killed for a superior that we're aware of and things like that. But basically, to get the transplant tourism, you really have to have the scale. This is the issue, right? Because how do you get that perfect match, right? It's very bad marketing if you're transplanting organs and they keep getting rejected in people, right? And people die. No, you need to have success. So, by the way, the other part with the Falun Gong was that they were known to be unusually healthy, especially don't drink, don't smoke, don't actually put any foreign things in the body, practice the slow motion exercises, right? And just so they actually built this transplant tourism system on the backs of the Falun Gong. In 2000, right after the Falun Gong persecution begins, the number of hospitals starts growing geometrically, kind of peaks in 2005. It sort of hits its first peak and then kind of continues a slower growth all the way through into the mid 2010s, okay? And by the time Ethan Gutmann, who's one of the heroes of this whole transplant research, forced organ harvesting transplant research process, he testifies in front of Congress under oath that there are 146 known hospitals that are doing 60 to 100,000 transplants per year, okay? And so that, by the way, that's the scale we're talking about, right? But when they started in 2000, it was really very low level and they were just figuring things out. But it's the mass incarceration of the Falun Gong and also the fact that they were considered to be enemies of the Communist Party, enemies of the people, and this was programmed into the population. That's what actually allowed for the massive growth and scaling. And now here's the real tragedy, okay? That once this was such a successful system, once they built this massive bureaucracy of death, if you will, all these, it's not just surgeons, right? You have whole transplant teams, nurses, all the people that are providing the materials, all of that. They added another group. So in 2015 or so, 2014, 2015, there was an isolated group in the northwest of China that was already somewhat dehumanized. They were different looking. They're called the Uyghur people, speak a different language, practice a different religion, a specific religion, Islam, and they basically dehumanized them further, incarcerated 1 million or 2 of them. And also, the whole area is up there in Xinjiang province is kind of a police state. It's strategically important, and they're actively enacting, what the US believes are officially genocidal policies against these people up there. So it's almost like the whole place is like a prison. And in fact, you could say that they were blood typing, tissue typing, and genotyping people in their homes. And to the best of our knowledge, a lot of the population, most of the population has actually been sort of tested for these vitals that could be used in the organ matching process. So this is the problem, right? When the international community largely ignores or even tacitly accepts this kind of extreme violation, this kind of atrocity, it kind of spreads to the next group. And I'm actually quite worried about this because I'm seeing this kind of dehumanizing rhetoric. We have sort of a few sort of anecdotal reports of House Christians, which is another persecuted group in China, being used, but not a lot of evidence around that. But what I am seeing is this real uptick in dehumanizing rhetoric against Christians. There's a whole church, the Zion Church, got rolled up recently. There's many people incarcerated. They're trying to stop that. The Catholic clergy are being controlled. That's something that's also recent. And there's some of the China human rights activists like Bob Fu, who runs China Aid. They concur with me. I actually had him on American Thought Leaders on my show. Thank you for mentioning it earlier, not too long ago. And he said, yeah, absolutely. There's this increased dehumanizing rhetoric. So does that mean that the Christians will be used next? I don't know. I can't predict that. But I do know that this dehumanizing rhetoric is always a part of kind of creating this black class. And in this case, which they've been very eager to use in this horrible, extreme way.
So all of this is obviously quite horrific, and kudos to the surgeon who came forward and warned about it. But there must be other people who've been involved in these procedures in the United States and elsewhere in the West, and they're essentially culpable of facilitating murders potentially. Is there any sort of internal domestic US investigation that you're aware of on the part of these transplant procedures?
This is an excellent question, okay? So here's what I know. First of all, this has to be done in China, okay? You'd have to ship a living person in effect, right? If you were going to try to do it elsewhere. Are there brokers? We do have evidence in Germany and some other places that some institutions are basically kind of in a very relaxed way saying, well, I don't know if I can help you, but maybe in China they can help you. And maybe, we don't know. I'm not aware of any in particular instance that I can prove where some doctor in the West said, yes, go to China and here's the address, here's the contact, okay? In the early years, there were even ads, okay? If you can imagine this, in 2006, this is the biggest problem with researching this, okay? Is that the moment that we would expose some particular piece of evidence, like for example, these ads which were online that said 2 weeks for a heart, here's the cost, right? Like that, it's crazy, like that existed, we have them archived. But the moment that we reported on that, it all went under, disappeared, right? This is kind of what happens. There were phone calls made, people asking about, can we get Falun Gong organs? Can we get them in 2 weeks? They said, yes, come, we'll set you up. Doctors on the other end from the hospital, right? So there's all this kind of stuff. It's very rare to get a surgeon that will admit to doing it. There's a few before it started scaling in a few contexts that have admitted to it. It's very rare to have someone in the West admit that they participated in it. There's actually, now this is a little bit of a complicated story, but a former mayor of Taipei in Taiwan who was a transplant surgeon, okay, a transplant doctor facilitating transplantation, he's actually in prison for 17 years for something unrelated, for corruption charges as we speak. But he was someone who knowingly supported the transplant system in China. Okay, so there are people like this. This one happens to be in jail for something that seems to be unrelated, right, in Taiwan, even though he learned what the, if you will, how that system worked. He still participated in supplying, teaching them, for example, how to use ECMO technology. I could explain what that is if you like, to help keep bodies perfused. So one of the ways that we're culpable, if I may extrapolate a bit about Western culpability, and there's a lot of it, okay, one thing that we absolutely do is we train surgeons, and the US trains Chinese transplant surgeons. We have, not all of them, but a significant number, like over 100 we're aware of at least. We provide various materials and solutions and technologies. Okay, so there's this technology called ECMO. And ECMO, I think it came online about 2012. And ECMO is heart and lung replacement tech. You plug, vascular surgeons kind of plug it into your body. And let's say that when there's a lot of damage in this area, you can kind of bypass that. And the machine kind of runs you, right, for the benefit of your heart and lungs while things are fixed there. That's the purpose of it, okay? But of course, it also doubles, as it happens with these really amazing life-saving technologies, as a body perfusion machine. If you have a body that you've, say, taken a heart out of to transplant, right? In the past, what they would have to do is just basically get rid of the body and get rid of the different organs. So each organ is worth quite a lot. A heart can be 100 or 200 grand, right? A kidney could, the lowest end of that is like 30 grand, right? It goes up to 100. So anyway, a whole body, right, can actually be very lucrative, right? So if you have ways in which you can make sure that multiple organs get transplant from a single body, and ECMO basically facilitates that by keeping a body perfused, kind of with the blood circulating for a couple of days, even if you've removed a heart. So he was, this guy, this Taiwanese, knowing what they were doing, he helped teach them how to use ECMO technology in their transplantation procedures, knowing full well that the whole system there is this kill to order approach. And by the way, I'll just mention this other fascinating piece of evidence. There were these two researchers, they published this in the American Journal of Transplantation about 3 years ago, okay? The title of the paper, if you can imagine this, is titled Execution by Organ Procurement, okay? You can look it up. And what they asked the question, because we have strong indication that it's most transplantation, if not all transplantation in China, is this kill to order style, right, transplantation. Is it possible that they've written into their scientific methods, the people who are doing research on this and publishing, because there's a whole publishing craze and so forth, right, that they've killed people by removing their organs, right? There's violations of the dead donor rule that have been written into the publicly available peer-reviewed scientific methods? And the answer was yes. In fact, they found 70 papers. They looked at about 2,000 plus papers, and they found 70 with very stringent criteria, right? Where it was very clear that the way the person died or were killed was by the organs being removed themselves, right? And so it's so normalized there. That's kind of how I read this, right? That they even write it into their scientific methods. They don't fully realize that it's a problem, right?
Mm-hmm. That reminds me actually of a book by Kazuo Ishiguro called Never Let Me Go. The story is about clones and that were used basically raised specifically for the purposes of ideal organ harvesting, but they weren't killed completely. The organs were removed one by one before they finally died. So they were kept alive as the non-vital organs were being removed, starting with kidneys, livers, and so forth. So this actually really reminds me of that book. The book was obviously science fiction, but raising a lot of philosophical and ethical questions. But clearly, it seems that that has become a reality, albeit not with clones, but with ordinary people. So that obviously the whole situation is extremely troubling, to put it mildly. How did you figure out that this whole thing was a system, and to what extent, how sophisticated has this system become at this point in time, by today?
Did you hear about this hot mic moment that happened last September where Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Kim Jong-un were in Tiananmen Square observing a military parade and they got caught on this hot mic, right?
Yes,
So they basically, I mean, I'll paraphrase the conversation, okay?
sure.
She says to Putin, when we're 70, we're just babies. And they're just a bit older than 70, okay? And then Putin replies, amazingly, he says, through continual organ transplantation, perhaps we can achieve immortality. Perhaps we can achieve immortality. And she responds, our target, maybe we can live to be 150, okay, in this century. And so this was a huge light bulb went off in my mind around this because I've been aware for some time that the Chinese Communist Party has an elite longevity project, okay? They specifically have an interest in extending the lives of the super elites. And by some measures, there's different estimates. Some of it is just their own propaganda. I don't know if it's true or not, but they say 8 to 15 years. I think it's from 2008 or so, 72 years being the kind of average lifespan, and they were saying we're living to 88 years. Okay. So there's this elite longevity project, which is certainly letting super elites live longer. I didn't know exactly how. There's not a lot of information about that. It's blood transfusions, diet. There's all sorts of things, some sort of drugs. But it was staring me in the face, right, all along that this forced organ harvesting industry, of course, is a centerpiece of this elite longevity project. Because the moment your organs starting to fail, if you're a super elite in China, you have unlimited access to organs in perpetuity. Like you can have as many organs as you want for however long you live. That's a benefit if being a Chinese super elite. That's astonishing, right? Of course, you have to have no moral boundary, which is unfortunately the case for people in that position as well. And I actually explain why that is in the book quite a bit. About half of my book is about this forced organ harvesting industry. The other half is to kind of understand the mind of the Communist Party and like how it makes decisions. Why, for example, why is there always atrocity in communist societies? This is all highly predictable. And in fact, this whole system, right, this whole kill to order organ trafficking system is actually something you would expect to happen in a communist society. It's a kind of what you would say is a feature, not a bug, because of their extreme instrumentalization of absolutely everything. Okay, whether it be human bodies, or recently I've been talking a lot about Iran on TV shows, how they instrumentalized Iran for their own benefit, for their own purposes, or even I write about this in the book, our goodwill and our naivete and our greed, right? These kinds of things, all of these things they're able to instrumentalize, to use as tools against us, and keeping the Chinese Communist Party supreme and kind of lasting forever, living forever.
You know, a troubling question arose in my mind as you were speaking about this, which is the question of euthanasia, which has become on the forefront of Western ethical discourse. We've heard of some very troubling stories. Initially, euthanasia was supposed to alleviate suffering and allow a way to die in dignity for people experiencing extreme physical conditions, like essentially stage 4 cancers, which at the point in time it was being discussed how to alleviate the pain. And now, since then, we are hearing about all sorts of breakthroughs around pancreatic cancer and so forth. But essentially, initially, it started out being an exceptional measure for exceptional situations. Now it has become quite widespread and recommended for people suffering from mental illnesses, depression, even mild discomfort from basic physical disabilities. So, to what extent can euthanasia kind of feed into the same mindset and be the same system? Can euthanized patients be used for organ harvesting? And would China play any role in something like that?
It's a very interesting question. So, the prime example of what you're talking about, of sort of this rush towards this normalization of euthanasia, has been Canada, actually my home country. I'm Canadian. Although all this has happened basically since I've left, since I haven't really been in Canada much. And I'll also add there's a very specific scenario where this grows very quickly, because in the US, even there's multiple states that have euthanasia laws, right, for these extreme situations. But there's only two countries in the world where it's actually a billing code. It functions like a treatment, like a doctor can prescribe it, if you will, or sort of offer it as a treatment of sorts. And that's in Canada and in Netherlands. And in both these countries, that's where you get the kind of thing that you described, where now they're considering actually allowing people who are just mentally ill or depressed or something like that take it, which is itself is a kind of a crazy concept, because if you're not competent to make the decision, why can you make the decision to kill yourself, right? It just doesn't make any sense. The problem is, right, what this really speaks to, I think this is why you connected it, right, is because it is this bizarre instrumentalization of the human being, right, that we're talking about. In something I talk a lot about in Killed to Order is the distinction between Hippocratic medicine and utilitarian bioethics, where Hippocratic medicine on one side is the doctor looks at the totality of the patient and is focused only on them and trying to figure out the best sort of way to help them. And if there's an intervention, it needs to have the minimal harm possible. And that's the kind of structure in which they're thinking, right? The utilitarian view is completely on the other end of the spectrum, if you will. It's a view that someone's looking at a population of people and they're saying, I'm trying to look out for the greatest good or the greatest happiness of my population. And so if I can achieve that somehow, but I need to sacrifice a few people to do it, that's okay. You can sacrifice the few for the good of the many, right? This struck me while I was writing the book, that you'll be very familiar with this. There's a famous maxim or infamous maxim. In order to make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs, right? And so there's some debate whether that was actually Stalin that said that, or whether it was Walter Duranty, his kind of famous apologist, right? New York Times journalist apologist. But the idea is, in order to achieve the great glorious revolution, we may have to sacrifice a few people, right? And this idea, I mean, of course, is part of why atrocity happens in every communist society, because that greatest good, right? That greatest good is the survival and supremacy of the Communist Party. And so, of course, that's always threatened in some ways. And if people need to die to help keep that greatest good, well, it happens, and it happens a lot in communist societies. That's fascinating, because it's in these communist societies where you see this extreme instrumentalization, right? It's kind of deep in the psyche of the system, if you will, right? And this euthanasia that you're talking about. I believe this is a way. You look at how Canada has had this very much too close relationship with communist China. It kind of went down for a few years but recently it's back, right? They're building more strategic partnerships and all of this. The problem is, right, like whenever you do have this deep engagement, someone's changing someone. There's no stasis, right? It's not like the mutual respect for our different ways or something like that. No, in fact, I argued actually in an op-ed in the Baltimore Sun last year that part of the reason the US transplant system has become softer on the dead donor rule, and we've had to decertify multiple transplant systems because the doctors got too easy in terms of deciding that someone's actually dead and ready to be harvested from, right? Systemically, they were basically, it looked like they were starting to harvest people that weren't really that, like, it wasn't that certain that they were going to pass away, right? So unlike the idea where we said, oh, we're going to change them, we're going to liberalize them if we put all that money in, this was the Kissinger doctrine for decades, right? I think it actually happened in the other direction where we've adopted this extreme utilitarianism because over there it is really the extreme, right? And now, in Canada, that's manifested as this kind of extreme version of euthanasia, where it's very easy for people to look and say, hey, look, our medical system is collapsing, which by the way it is, right? In Canada, it's sort of deeply oversubscribed. People wait really long periods of time to get very simple procedures. It's actually is offered very easily. There's actually a law in Alberta that's kind of considering being passed where a medical practitioner isn't allowed to kind of encourage someone, right, to get made. Someone has to come to the medical practitioner and say, I want this, right? But as we speak, anecdotally, we have lots of examples of this. The MAID practitioners come to people and say, look, have you considered, the person isn't going to die, right? At least not for a while. They're told, hey, have you considered MAID as a treatment, right? And this is the problem with it being this kind of considered a treatment in the first place. So it's really about this mentality, this highly utilitarian mentality, but it's sort of kind of hidden in this veneer of compassion and trying to give people choice and libertarianism and give people choice and so forth. But really, it seems to me like it's a system that the incentives are set up for a system that's failing financially to help cut its costs dramatically. And a smaller aging population is the easiest way to do that. And that's what's happening.
I mean, obviously, such a system can also be easily exploited for abuse, with fraud, with family members who stand to profit from either insurance or from
100%.
Inheritance, and simply getting rid of a burdensome relation that, yeah.
Or Irina, going back to organs, right? You can even imagine a commercial where someone's saying, look, if you're kind of, you're older, your kids aren't around very much, what do you really have to live for? But hey, you could actually do something really great, and you could donate your organs and you could help give the gift of life, right, to someone, right? And I can imagine people thinking about that. And again, a big lesson of the past years for me has been that propaganda works, right? And when you're in a situation where media have let's just say, like in Canada's situation, have a lot of government influence, right? It would be very easy to propagandize a population around things like this. Again, in a situation where Canada's economy is in to say extremely rough shape is a kind of a nice way of putting it.
Do you believe that the social credit system in China could also pave a way for the extreme cases of such socially credit unworthy people being used for such for such procedures?
100%. Because so this is what's interesting, right? Like social media has changed our whole relationship with media, right? I'm using social media as an example because you can think about how we tend to watch certain types of programs because they speak to our particular biases and our thoughts about the world. And we can actually get caught up in these sort of silos of thought, right? And similarly, right, we actually have, through something like a social credit system, there's different variations of this that exist already in different parts of the world. In China, it's particularly extreme, where you have a whole lot of a person's information kind of in one profile, if you will, right? All of their online activity, their phone calls, whether they jaywalked that day, if they said something bad, right? All of it. And also, right? Also their health records, right? In many cases, right? All this stuff can be kind of sort of kept in one place. So it creates an incredible vulnerability, right? Because, yeah, absolutely, right? Like in the mind of the Chinese Communist Party, it's perfectly reasonable to use people who are enemies, so to speak, right? And enemies are defined by not sufficiently loyal and or performatively loyal to the Communist Party itself for these sorts of purposes, right? And so if you do have a lot of people's vitals, like what they did in Xinjiang, you can think of that as a kind of a prototype, right? Situation where, like, why not have the whole population? Why are they gathering genetic information on every people in the around the world too, right? It's just sort of a kind of set building capacity around being able to apply this extreme utilitarian view in all sorts of ways, and organ harvesting would just be one piece of that. But like, why wouldn't it happen, right? If someone is low enough in the social credit system, maybe there's some kind of sort of I don't know, point at which someone becomes usable. But for the super elites, right? I actually don't think there's any bar, because these super elites are kind of viewed as, they're the vanguard, right? They're the people who are the party personified, if you will. So I think, like, really anybody could be used for their benefit, right? It doesn't even need to be an enemy of the state. So you can kind of see things going in that direction. If we're talking kind of theoretically, that's the mentality, because it's for the good of the party, right? Like, wouldn't you want to give your life for the good of the party? That's the right thing to do, comrade, right? That's the way of thinking.
So one thing that struck me, you describe a convergence between state power, meaning the Communist Party, the medical institutions, and security services. So how do these relationships actually function in practice, and what can we learn about the governance structures and the role of the government in all of this?
Right. So this is actually extremely important. Communist China is a totalitarian system, okay, and it's an incredibly important distinction, because it has and as such is obscenely hierarchical, okay. At the top of the system is the Politburo Standing Committee, and then the Politburo, okay, and literally everything else is underneath it is required to follow the directives from the top. There's a scholar at Stanford University called Chenggang Xu, of a brilliant mind, recently wrote his opus book. It's called Institutional Genes. And in Institutional Genes, one of the things he explains is the innovation that the Chinese Communist Party has over the Soviet Union. Why did the Chinese communism survive when Soviet communism failed? And he argues, and I think quite convincingly, that they created what he calls RAT, regionally administered totalitarianism. Okay. So what that meant is, instead of having actual instructions coming all the way from the top, okay, they just kind of put general goals that then create. So for example, right, one of the top 7 priorities of the Chinese is military civil fusion. Military civil fusion doctrine just means that if there is a military application for some kind of commercial endeavor, it needs to be explored. It needs to be done in collaboration with the PLA, with the military, okay? And so we're talking about sort of partnerships or kind of commercial endeavors, US, China, and so forth. But what it also means is that heads roll if people don't apply it. Everybody understands that they have to apply military civil fusion, right? Otherwise, they could be in deep trouble. And and if you do it particularly well, you'll get a lot of benefits. So it creates a kind of a market of competition, if you will, around implementing the kind of overall goals and kind of vision of the top. And so the reason I'm mentioning all this is that nothing is really entirely independent. We know that most of the hospitals doing the forced organ harvesting are military. Okay. So but that doesn't mean that sort of the public security is excluded, right? The public security might be doing the arresting of the people originally and incarcerating them and so forth and managing that, right? But it doesn't mean that they don't end up in the military hospital and under military jurisdiction once that happens. And the idea, again, that the super elites need to have this sort of access to longevity through organs or longevity in general, that's an overall directive. None of these institutions are actually independent. They're all wholly accountable to the Communist Party. And in fact, the distinction between totalitarianism and mere authoritarianism, if you will, is that totalitarian societies, especially communist societies, destroy all civil society, because it's in civil society that change manifests. This is something also that Chenggang Shu talks about in his work, which is, again, absolutely fascinating on this issue. So the answer is, simply, when there's an issue that's a very high priority for the top, there's deep collaboration that happens between the different institutions, like the ones that you mentioned.
So, in other words, there's no real way to separate the medical institutions from the government, and
There isn't. Not as long as the Chinese Communist Party is in power.
so in terms of global transplant tourism, of course, you mentioned the role of brokers for advertising the sort of service potential and attracting willing people who are with money to somebody else's organs. But the question is also, is there more evidence of how that works? How how does China target these potential brokers, hospitals, or patients? How do they establish those relationships? Is there any sort of a pipeline?
So at the moment, I can't answer that question. We knew how
Mm-hmm,
it worked in the past a bit more.
mm-hmm,
Okay. For example, there were these ads. For example, there were these different hospital partnerships. But as we sort of popularized this stuff, it really went deep underground. And so
sure.
today, I have evidence. I know of one scenario in Germany where there's a woman. So this is kind of a crazy situation. The woman is a heavy drinker, okay, and she also has a special particular liver condition, which makes her liver more susceptible to cirrhosis, as I understand it. And she also is this heavy drinker, so she killed her liver, so to speak, right, through this alcoholism, and then she went to China and got a transplant, and she actually has done this now 3 times, okay, and it's just astonishing. I'm just giving this as an example of kind of the excesses that you can get.
Mm.
There's other sort of anecdotes of this type of nature where multiple organs are supplied to a person because they're not matching, for example, and they just keep getting more and more, like in quick succession. Again, sort of showing that this really happens. But how did this person originally kind of know about this in the first place? Well, the theory is it happened through a local hospital. There's some evidence that this is what happened. I don't want to speak to it too strongly,
Mm.
but basically, because of the condition the person had, they were not going to be able to find an organ in Germany, right? And so someone said, hey, look, there's this other option. And I actually start my book with a kind of a composite character that needs a kidney badly, and then hears about the China option, can get it quickly. And this isn't a bad person even. She just doesn't really know exactly what's going on. And this is just something that she kind of overheard someone had done and was successful, right? And I think it happens that way for especially in these communities of people that are looking for some kind of relief. The Chinese Communist Party weaponizes our desperation against us, and it's like people are desperate. They want to live for their families. Not everyone is a psychopath ready, or not everyone's ready to have someone killed for their organs, so to speak. You can also not notice something because you're desperate and you really don't want to know, right? If you will, that's kind of in our psychology. And I think that probably happens a lot too. But to go back, I don't want to totally avoid your question here. We don't exactly understand right now
Mm.
how the transplant tourism happens, but our strong suspicion is that people basically go to China, and once you're there, right, you're basically in a way protected because you can go to the place and kind of figure it out there without attracting the snooping eye of journalists and researchers and so forth that are outside. It's a lot harder to do that there because, of course, as we've been talking about, it's a totalitarian regime that controls the system, and this is one of its closest guarded secrets, right? It'll never admit to.
Have any of the recipients of these donations, of these transplants, been investigated upon their return to their Western countries?
So in most cases, no. I mean, well, this isn't a recipient, but there's actually a survivor of the explantation, which is
Mm.
shocking in itself, but someone who's missing part of his liver and part of his lung. We're not clear why his lung. That was a kind of a miracle. I never expected we would see someone like that. With people who are receiving them, okay, we have not there is no database like this that I'm aware of. There's no really way to track them. And of course, these people are not interested in advertising what they've done, clearly, right? However, there is a way to do it. And I think this is something like that would be very interesting if we could basically, the problem is there's laws to protect patient privacy, which are very important, by the way, right? And this kind of limits this. But if we could have eyes into people who are, for example, taking anti-rejection drugs, which every organ transplant recipient needs to take, but never got a transplant in the US or some other credible country, that would be a very interesting database of people to look at, right? We could get a lot of information from that and possibly talk to them. At the moment, it's not a criminal to do this, right? Even though of course it's murder, right? I'm not a lawyer, right? But you're having someone killed. It's sort of like some kind of hiring a hitman, right? To kill someone, even though you don't know who it is. It's obviously intentional, but maybe you didn't know about it entirely, right? You see, it's like kind of a bit murky, but someone's being killed for your organs. So there's even I put in my book, there's even sort of ways of trying to deal with this legally that have been proposed but mostly what we focused on up to now is, well, one, establishing that it's real, because it's very, very difficult. Part of the reason why it hasn't gotten as much traction, it's just so unbelievable, right? And it's really only in the last few years, to my eye, that people are willing to accept it. In the early years, people would just leave in the middle of conversations, Irina, like mentally, I mean, I couldn't really talk about it very much even. But that's shifted, that's changed. I think we're ready for that. There's 6 American states that have laws that say Medicare, Medicaid, and insurance can't pay for China transplants. So that prevents a lot of people who would use that, wouldn't prevent the people who pay out of pocket, but it'll prevent the people who are somehow supported. And the original law that was actually in Israel in 2008, that's basically stopped most China transplants that were happening from there. So that's kind of that's been the approach mostly thus far. I think the place to start, right, when it comes to legislation or policy, there's a couple of things that can be done. One is cut off all contact with the transplant system in China, because you're aiding and abetting an atrocity by doing that, right? Basically, these are easy things that we could do that we haven't done, right? We're still training those surgeons. We're still providing technologies. We still have hospital partnerships. We have funding relationships. NIH is funding some things. There's even a letter about that to Harvard some months ago from the Select Committee on the CCP. So there's that side. Of course, we shouldn't pay for anybody getting a transplant there in any way. That, I think, and 3, we should establish in law that this is an atrocity. And there's actually there's a piece of legislation called it's S4009 off the top of my head. It's a Senate bill called the Falun Gong and Victims of Forced Organ Harvesting Protection Act. Passed the House unanimously. It's been kind of slightly modified in the Senate, but it would establishing officially that this is an atrocity. It would ask that question and establish it in law. That would be an incredibly important step. Otherwise, it's all kind of the people say, "Is this really happening?" I even had with my book coming out, I've had a lot of coverage of it. And one of the New York Post article, which by the way, I appreciated the New York Post article being written in the first place a lot. They kind of, in the end, they're still asking the question, is this really happening, right? And as David Matas said, who was one of the kind of hero researchers of this, he's like, the problem isn't too little evidence, the problem is too much evidence. The evidence is voluminous and plentiful, if you will, all sorts of angles, but we haven't established basically in law that this is real, this is happening, and then we could build all sorts of policy on top of that, right? It's saying the U.S. government believes this is an atrocity, right? The US government understands this is real and is an atrocity. So I think that's the stage that we're at. But those things could be done quickly. The Senate could be passing these bills. There could be more of these state level bills passed. There's even actually a bill like that in the federal government. Congressman Neil Dunn. It's called the Block Act to stop the sort of payment at the federal level for China transplants. HHS, for example, and NIH could have a policy very quickly. No cooperation of any sort, no funding, no training with transplantation, and do it loudly, right? I think that would be very good. That would be a very good approach because it would make people aware, at least for those that are kind of blindly walking into this, that it's not an ethical thing, right? And that that this is real and that we're taking a stand that we shouldn't be allowing it. So, and frankly, that legislation, it will make it harder for them to do it because they are still dependent on a lot of our technologies and so forth for this. I think you should also have export controls on some of these technologies to China, obviously. But.
So that leads me to the final question to tie it all up. What response has there been from the US government, or for that matter from the Chinese government, to your book coming out? Has there been any invitations to testify in Congress, and have there been any threats or official denials or anything like that?
So the Chinese Communist Party rarely comments on this, and I'm not aware of a comment about my book yet. The last time I heard a substantive comment, it was the survivor coming out, got a lot of press, mostly in the UK, not here, even though he came out in the US. And they actually shockingly admitted to the fact that they operated on him. They said it was for his own good. They came up with a different story, but they actually admitted that they operated on him and it was obviously against his will. So there's an interesting data point there. They seem to, whenever they do take a stand, they typically just attack the messenger. They just say, oh, that you're evil, you're propaganda or whatever. Nothing with the book so far. There's been some discussions about hearings. Absolutely. I have actually done I've done one briefing to an entity in the administration that's related to trafficking, that focuses on trafficking. So there is an interest at the legislative level, at the administration level, and I want to see how far we can take it, right? That's kind of where I'm at. And the biggest thing that I really see that's different is finally people are, I think it might have been partially because of what we saw China do during COVID, the zero COVID policies, welding people into their homes. I think it maybe opened up our minds to some really horrible practices that could be done there. And so people tend to just administration institution that I mentioned. Actually, I was there. So this was the ONDCP at the White House. The room was packed, and a lot of people were fascinated, even though they focus on drug trafficking specifically, but they're very interested in the intersection of drug trafficking and other forms of trafficking, which is why I was invited to test it, to brief them. But amazing questions. So I knew people were serious and listening and kind of engaged, and so I'm getting a lot of very good feedback.
Well, that's great to hear, and really hope as President Trump's visit to China is approaching in May, that there's going to be a lot more of a push to do something about this issue in terms of greater exposure, more investigative resources. And you mentioned just now the point about exploring the intersection between drug trafficking and other forms of trafficking. Organ trafficking obviously is one of those things. Have you noticed that there are some other third parties that may be benefiting from this process, who are not the Chinese government, but who may be terrorist groups, cartels, or other governments?
Yeah, I mean, I have not explored this very much, to be honest, but I can imagine all sorts of ways, right? The moment that you start talking about this nexus of people of institutions that have that lack this moral boundary, as the kind of mafia-like, if you will, right, kind of institutions, which in fact, I think you could argue convincingly that one of the best ways to understand how the CCP works is a kind of a mafia-like structure. People describe it as an international criminal organization. I think that's probably accurate. It would certainly be logical to label it that way. So the short is, if there is financial or otherwise benefit here, I think that probably these types of things are being explored, or a longevity benefit. I think there's a lot of possibility that the Chinese Communist Party has been trying to facilitate the complicity of other institutions, Western, but especially these ones which have that are dictatorships that have moral boundaries. And some people have even argued that this hot mic moment, right, that we talked about earlier, wasn't really a hot mic moment. It was actually advertising, right? Because they believe that there's no way that a tightly controlled system like the Chinese Central Television could ever have a hot mic moment. They're way too controlled. And heads would roll, right? Or heads did roll if it really was a hot mic moment. So they think it was kind of just that saying, hey, if you want to join our club of the long life, if you don't mind having people killed for organs, give us a call. I don't know if that's true. I tend to think it's a hot mic moment.
Well, thank you so much for this insightful and in many ways horrifying look at a system that is lurking in the shadows and most of us know little about and in a lot of cases don't really want to think about. But I do think it's very important to understand how the Chinese Communist Party is corrupting and influencing everything it's touching, including basic ethical norms in the West. And I hope audiences will read the book Kill to Order wherever it's available, Amazon, I'm presuming, and hopefully pass the word around to others. I think it deserves far greater exposure. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us this evening. We'll be back next week, Tuesday night, 9 p.m. as usual. The Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio.
Thank you, Irina.
Thank you.